In late 1985, game designers Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura had the vision of a perfect game. An RPG with all the sophistication of Western computer titles like Wizardry and Ultima, but designed for ease of use in a format that would put it into the hands of millions of kids. The Famicom, better known in the West as the Nintendo Entertainment System. 1986's Dragon Quest became the first step towards that vision. A simple yet addictive proof of concept that would teach a generation of kids how to play an RPG. The next year, Dragon Quest II added many of the features that had to be cut from the first game, but it was still an incomplete experience. It was only with their third title that their efforts would truly pay off, and the result was an absolute triumph of game design. This is my retrospective review of Dragon Quest III, the culmination of a vision. Dragon Quest III was released on February 10th, 1988, just over a year after the second game. While this would be seen as a very short development cycle by today's standards, it was fairly typical of the 80s, where sequels were often produced on a yearly basis. Up until now, Dragon Quest had been the undisputed champion of the genre, but the second half of 1987 was a big year for Japanese console RPGs, with 3 landmark titles entering the market for the first time. Digital Devil's Story Megami Tensei, released for the Famicom on September 11th, followed by another Famicom game, Final Fantasy, on December 18th, and Phantasy Star for the Sega Master System, released 2 days later on December 20th. However, while these 3 titles were all successful in their own right, Dragon Quest III would blow them all out of the water. Planning for Dragon Quest III began in January of 1987. Enix would publish the game, but development was once again handled by Koichi Nakamura's Chunsoft, with Nakamura himself serving as game director, and his co-creator Yuji Horii taking on the role of main designer. Dragon Quest II's troubled development cycle is a well-documented fact, but there aren't nearly as many stories to be found about the making of Dragon Quest III. By all accounts, the process seems to have gone fairly smoothly, with the growing development team learning from the mistakes of the previous project. Better hardware helped too. During the lifespan of the Famicom, the memory capacity of game cartridges exploded in size, which meant that Dragon Quest III would have an entire 2 megabits of memory to work with, twice as much as Dragon Quest II and about 4 times as much as the original game. Not a lot by modern standards, we're talking the equivalent of 250 kilobytes here, but it meant a great deal to Nakamura and Horii. Twice as much space meant a lot more room to realize their long-held ambition, the game they'd wanted to create all along. To make the most of this opportunity, the development team would also have to grow. Nakamura had been solely responsible for all the code of the first Dragon Quest, but for the second game, he had brought on a handful of co-developers to help share the load. For Dragon Quest III, the operation was scaled up to around 20 people, with all but 2 of them, Yuji Horii and his assistant, who worked on the game's scenario, being programmers. As a result, Nakamura himself took yet another step back from his coding duties in order to manage the growing enterprise, describing his role in development as more of a project manager, while still contributing around 10% of the game's code. Meanwhile, Yuji Horii took charge of the game's story, outlined the various events, and personally drew all of the dungeon and town maps. During planning, the team would have frequent meetings to debate the game's direction. Horii and Nakamura describe a passionate environment. Each member got a say in the discussions, and the team argued endlessly, often long into the night, about how to go about different aspects of the game. Nonetheless, a lot of the game's design came down to the interplay between Horii and Nakamura, who by now had developed an exceptionally effective partnership. Horii compared the relationship between him and Nakamura to that of a manga artist and a story writer, where the writer would describe the scene and the artist would use their intuition to depict it visually. In the end, the team estimated that Dragon Quest III had 4 times as much content as the previous title. But even with twice the memory, they couldn't fit everything they wanted into the game. Many story events were cut, and some clever ideas had to be removed, such as the concept of mini-medals, special collectibles that could be turned in for unique rewards, an idea that would have to wait until Dragon Quest IV to see the light of day. A key factor in the game's development was a more structured approach. A slightly longer development cycle and better project management meant the team could take the proper time to thoroughly test the game. Many of Dragon Quest II's flaws can be pinned on the fact that not a single person on the team had a chance to play the game through from start to finish before it launched. With Dragon Quest III, the team could really hunker down and take the product apart piece by piece, fine-tuning dungeons, monsters, and spells. About 70% of the first draft ended up being revised in the process, with the result that Horii and Nakamura felt comfortable saying that Dragon Quest III was a perfectly balanced game. And while I maybe wouldn't go quite as far as that, there's no denying that Dragon Quest III was a massive step forward from the previous title. In this video, we'll be looking at the original version of Dragon Quest III for the Nintendo Famicom, later released in North America for the NES as Dragon Warrior 3. Various remakes of the game include many changes that impact the overall experience. So if you've played another version of this game, some of the stuff I talk about might sound a little bit off. Also, I'll be using the names of characters, spells, and locations from the original North American localization, many of which are different from the ones in the Japanese original, as well as later English translations. At its core, Dragon Quest III is a very similar game to the previous two titles. You explore a large overworld viewed from a top-down perspective, traversing different terrains on your journey between towns, dungeons, and other points of interest. Towns provide safe havens where you can upgrade your equipment and gather information, while dungeons hide treasure and key items you need to advance your quest. Enemies are fought in random encounters that play out on a separate screen and are viewed from a first-person perspective. Battles are turn-based, and you choose your character's actions from a menu before the start of each round. Defeating monsters rewards the surviving characters with experience points and gold, which allow you to grow stronger and take on ever harder challenges. Outside of combat, you can move freely in 4 directions, but even basic operations like talking to an NPC or opening a locked door are performed by picking the appropriate option from the game's menu. Graphically, Dragon Quest III looks more or less the same as before, but an expanded tileset adds more detail to the game's locations, allowing for environments that look visually distinct from each other, like the village of Jipang with its torii gates, or the wooden deck of the Phantom ship. This is also the first game in the series to feature actual furniture in towns and castles. Tables, chairs, and beds are now represented with special tiles, where the previous game just showed them as white squares. The game's most impressive visual feature is its day-night cycle, which allows the world map to change between noon, evening, night, and morning as you journey across the overworld. Each terrain tile has multiple variations for the time of day, and watching forests and hills shift from bright colors to darker shades of blues and greens adds a lot of flavor to the overall experience. On the other hand, I was kind of disappointed to see that Dragon Quest III still doesn't have any battle backdrops. Encounters with enemies take place on a pitch-black field, which obviously isn't a huge deal, but it is a bit of a shame. Having a cute little backdrop for each environment would have added a bit of immersion to the combat experience. While the game's engine stayed mostly the same, the gameplay saw some major improvements, and ironically, one of them had some unfortunate consequences for the game's visuals. As I explained in my retrospective of Dragon Quest II, limitations of the Famicom's hardware meant it wasn't possible to line up more than 4 characters horizontally on the screen without causing a flicker effect. Unwilling to accept this unfortunate compromise, Yuji Horii solved the issue by limiting the player party to 3 characters, so they could all line up to talk to an NPC without any problems. For Dragon Quest III, the player party was expanded to 4 characters, which meant that the number of situations where flicker would happen were drastically increased. given how adamant Horii was about preventing this issue in the second game, I'm surprised he changed his mind for the third title. I couldn't find an interview where he justified his change of direction, so I can only assume that Horii eventually decided the upside of having a 4-person party was worth the occasional flicker. Especially since this was an extremely common issue with Famicom games of the time. And while it was most likely the right decision to make, having to deal with constant flicker in the game's towns really makes me appreciate the more conservative design choice in Dragon Quest II. It's not the end of the world, but it is pretty annoying. In this modern climate of gamers complaining about FPS drops and low resolutions, it's kind of hilarious to think that we used to be okay with this kind of nonsense. But screen flicker wasn't the only reason Horii had stopped at 3 playable characters for Dragon Quest II. There was also a more practical concern to keep in mind. To solve this issue, Dragon Quest III would receive a major upgrade to its fundamental architecture. Something that hadn't been possible in the previous 2 games, but which now became more or less a necessity. Unlike a modern system, early generations of video game consoles like the Famicom didn't have a hard drive, so any data the game wanted to write had to be stored on the game cartridge itself, which was a bit of a problem since the cartridges of the time didn't have any rewritable memory that would remain after the console was powered off. Many Famicom games were short enough that this wasn't an issue. You'd simply start a new game from scratch each time you played, and part of the challenge was to reach the end before your bedtime. But Dragon Quest was an epic adventure designed to be played over a period of days, if not weeks. To get around this issue, the original Japanese versions of Dragon Quest and Dragon Quest II used a feature called the Spell of Restoration to store and recall player data. A simple password system where players would copy down long clunky strings of hiragana on paper at the end of each session, and then manually feed them back into the game the next time they played. And hopefully you didn't make a mistake or misread any of the characters. The Spell of Restoration had capped out at a reasonable-ish 20 characters in the original Dragon Quest, but even with Koichi Nakamura's mathematical wizardry at play, it swelled to a maximum of 52 characters to write down in Dragon Quest II. With 4 heroes and certain other advanced features we'll get into later, for the Spell of Restoration to work for Dragon Quest III, it would have to grow to impossible proportions. Fortunately, by 1988, an ingenious solution to this problem had already made its way into the library of Famicom games. By including a static random access memory or SRAM chip powered by a button cell inside the cartridge, player data could now be stored between sessions even when the power was switched off. Many people point to The Legend of Zelda as being the first title to use this solution, but that's only true when you consider the North American market. In Japan, The Legend of Zelda had been released for the Famicom Disk System, which used a disk-based storage to deliver its games. The first cartridge game that used this solution seems to have been Morita Shogi, a Japanese chess game released on April 14, 1987. The inclusion of battery-powered SRAM added to the cost of the cartridge, but the investment made sense for more complex games, and by the end of 1987, it was starting to become popular. By the time the original Dragon Quest reached North America in 1989, the battery-powered save feature had been retrofitted into the game, meaning that Western gamers never had to bother with the Spell of Restoration at all. But Dragon Quest III was the first game in the series that was built around the existence of a save game feature, which meant they could now do some pretty cool things that hadn't been possible before. And the 4-person party was only the beginning. Just like in the previous games, your inventory is limited to 8 items per character, and since this space has to account for medicinal herbs, key items, spare equipment, and even the stuff the character is using, it fills up fast, so you have to be strategic about what to keep and what to toss. With the removal of the Spell of Restoration, Dragon Quest III could have relaxed this restriction, but Horii decided to go another route. Instead, Dragon Quest III introduced the Vault, an NPC in town where you can store and retrieve items and gold you don't want to carry. The vault is a game changer when it comes to inventory management, allowing you to hang on to that extra sword that's a bit situational, spare armor you might need later, or bundles and bundles of extra healing items. But perhaps the single biggest benefit of the vault is the option to unload any key items that have played out their role. A huge relief, considering how badly these items would clog up your inventory towards the end of the game in Dragon Quest II. The vault also lets you store gold, keeping it safe in town while you're off on a dangerous journey. True to the series' design principle, Dragon Quest III doesn't have a game over screen. Instead, suffering a total party wipeout sends you back to the king with your XP and items intact, but only half your gold. By securing your gold in the vault, the game now allows you to bypass this penalty, making risk-taking a bit more appealing. But the most significant feature made possible by the abolishment of the spell of restoration is also the one that became Dragon Quest III's unique selling point. This was something that Horii and Nakamura had wanted to include since the original Dragon Quest, but it was only now, with the third game, that they were able to make it a reality. Originally released for the Apple II in September of 1981, the early American computer RPG Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, quickly became a sensation among computer hobbyists. Inspired by old-school dungeon-crawling campaigns from Dungeons & Dragons, Wizardry let you form your own adventuring party from a pool of characters you yourself created by visiting Gilgamesh's tavern, before setting out on a tense, pulse-pounding exploration of an underground labyrinth filled with random encounters, traps, and sweet, sweet treasure. Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura had come into contact with Wizardry through the Japanese PC gaming scene, and like many of their fellow enthusiasts, they became obsessed. The idea of creating your own party from a wealth of options, testing it out against a host of unknown dangers, and then trying again and again and again with a different set of choices proved incredibly addictive. This was the fundamental experience they wanted to recreate for the Famicom when they first set out to make Dragon Quest, although in a slightly less unforgiving format. With Dragon Quest III, Horii and Nakamura were finally able to bring to fruition their own version of Wizardry's party creation system, a recurring feature in the Dragon Quest series that has since become known in English as the Vocational system. By visiting Louisa's place in the starting town of Aliahan, the game's own version of Gilgamesh's tavern, you can create and manage your own set of companions, adding and removing them from your party as the need strikes you. With the Vocational system, you finally have full control of your own party. You decide who joins and when, and which of 6 different vocations they should be: Soldier, Pilgrim, Wizard, Fighter, Merchant, and Goof-Off. Each vocation has its own strengths and weaknesses, and the combination of characters you recruit will drastically impact the experience you have with the game. But unlike Final Fantasy, another Famicom RPG inspired by Wizardry, where the choices you make about your party are locked in for the entire playthrough, Dragon Quest III lets you change your mind whenever you want. Anytime you think you could do better, you can always head to Louisa's place and swap out your party members. The characters you put on the bench will remain in their roster, waiting to be called back into action. Louisa's place allows you to store an additional 8 characters outside of the main party, a feature that would have been unthinkable with the spell of restoration. Horii did allow for one major departure from the Wizardry formula by sticking to his cardinal rule for RPGs, that the player themselves should be the hero of the story. Which is why the game also has a special vocation, the hero, that's only available to the player avatar. The hero also solves for an important aspect of Dragon Quest's fundamental design philosophy, that the game should be user-friendly and accessible to newcomers. While there are many ways to form a viable party in Dragon Quest III, some setups are far easier to use than others. To ensure that the average player would have all the tools required to actually beat the game, Yuji Horii made the hero a true all-rounder. You can fight nearly as well as a soldier, cast some of the game's most powerful attack spells, and even heal your allies. The hero can do pretty much everything, and since you're always in the party, whatever choices you make in filling the other 3 slots, you'll always have a fighting chance. There is also a special 8th vocation for characters to take on, the Sage, a powerful magic user who can master every spell in the game, but you can't make a Sage during character creation. Instead, a character must become a Sage. After reaching the Temple of Dhamma, about a third of the way through the quest, you gain the ability to put your characters through a vocation change. Any character can switch to any of the 6 starting vocations. A character that changes vocations starts over from level 1, but they get to keep half of their previous attributes and all of the spells they've already learned. This allows you to make characters that combine the traits of multiple vocations. A soldier that knows wizard spells, a merchant with the speed of a fighter, or any other combination you could think of. And you can repeat this process as many times as you like, molding your characters into the exact mix of attributes you prefer. This is also how a character might become a Sage, but here you have an interesting choice to make. Normally, you need a special item called the Book of Satori in order to change a character into a Sage. But this restriction doesn't apply to the Goof-Off. The Goof-Off is basically a joke vocation, a character that isn't very good at anything at all and will often play pranks in battle instead of following orders. The Goof-Off was intended as an opportunity for advanced players to give themselves an extra challenge, but it's also a viable trade-off. Since the Goof-Off can become a Sage without the Book of Satori, the game offers you a choice about how you want to play the game. Work a little bit harder in the early game for the promise of a stronger endgame. And that's really cool design. Every aspect of the vocation system was designed with player choice in mind. There are literally a million different ways to play Dragon Quest III, and each player now has the freedom to tailor their party to their personal playstyle. But in reality, most players' parties are going to look fairly similar. The vocation system was a very big deal for its time, especially given the context from which it arose. After having gotten a taste of fixed party dynamics in Dragon Quest II, where you had to play the hand you were dealt, with all of its flaws and limitations, the sequel was the perfect time to introduce true party customization. Players who had cursed the Prince of Cannock's tendency to fall in battle, or the Princess of Moonbrook's inability to revive allies, could now form exactly the party they wanted. And that kind of freedom can feel intoxicating. You can build whatever kind of party you prefer. You can choose to recruit only 1 or 2 allies, or none at all if you prefer to attempt the quest on your own. And in fact, even the hero isn't entirely mandatory. Once you've beaten the game at least once, Louisa's Place lets you dismiss the hero from the party, putting you at last in complete control of your party makeup. But in spite of all the options laid out before me, the route I ended up taking is very conventional. Bladewind the Soldier would act as my vanguard, Rinne the Pilgrim would be my healer, and Jigena the Wizard would sling fire and ice at my enemies. I stuck with this setup until I reached the Temple of Dhamma, where I made Jigena and Bladewind switch roles. My soldier became a wizard, and my wizard became a soldier. After a detour to the Tower of Garuna to pick up the Book of Satori, Rinne became a sage. And that was about it. I would have been up for a lot more tinkering, but as cool as the vocation system is, I ultimately found this version of it a little disappointing. To begin with, the vocation system is highly reliant on grinding. Whether you create a new character to fill a missing role or change the vocation of an existing one, they'll be starting over from level 1. Characters who twiddle their thumbs at Louisa's Place don't earn any experience, and since the game has no XP scaling, it can take quite a while to bring a baby character up to speed. So even if I could have had an easier time with certain dungeons by switching things up, I never really felt like it was worth the effort, which is in sharp contrast to something like Final Fantasy V's job system, where a character's level isn't tied to their job rank, so swapping a character's role doesn't come at so high a cost. But my biggest beef with the vocation system has to do with how the game handles stats. When a character levels up, they obviously gain a few attribute points, depending on their current vocation. Fighters get a lot of strength and agility, but not so much intelligence. When a character changes vocations, they start over at level 1, but get to keep half of the stats they had. In theory, this means you should be able to grind your way to an incredibly strong character by continuously leveling up and changing vocations. But the game has a mechanic in place, specifically to prevent this. Each vocation has a baseline for the expected value of the character's attributes based on their vocation and level. When a character levels up, any attributes of theirs that are below that baseline will gain points as normal. But if you're above the baseline, you either get a static +1 bonus or nothing at all. So if your attributes are already too high for your vocation and level, you're hardly going to get stronger at all. The baseline mechanic ensures that no character ends up completely useless, no matter what kind of bizarre career path you put them through. But it also keeps them from getting out of hand, which to me is actually a bad thing. I love being able to apply my understanding of a game system and put a little effort into breaking it open, and I felt really kind of sad when I realized Dragon Quest III wasn't going to let me do that. For all of its limitations, the vocation system was an incredibly ambitious feature for a console RPG of its day. Given how much time I sank into executing different builds in games like Baldur's Gate when I was younger, I think I would have been absolutely obsessed with Dragon Quest III as a kid. Where the vocation system really shines is on multiple playthroughs, and I'm already plotting out what kind of party to run the next time I inevitably make my way through some version of this game. Of course, creating the party of your dreams can be a lot of fun, but the true enjoyment from a system like this only comes when you put those choices to the test in a life or death situation. Going into Dragon Quest III, Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura had a couple of goals in mind for the game's combat system. Although they had been pretty happy with the way battles played out in the previous title, for the third game, they wanted the monster slaying experience to be more strategic, varied, and exciting. They wanted support spells to play a bigger part than before, and for players to have a wealth of options to experiment with. And I think they pretty much nailed it. The fundamentals remain very much the same. Battles are turn-based. You control the heroes through commands chosen from a menu, and the action plays out as separate rounds of combat, where heroes and monsters take turns attacking, casting spells, or using items. There is also a parry command that lets you take up a defensive stance that reduces incoming damage during the upcoming round. Combat is slow-paced and encourages methodical thinking, especially since the game still clings to some old-school conventions of turn-based combat. You target groups of monsters rather than individual enemies, so you're not in complete control of who you hit. And the lack of auto-targeting means that if a character takes a swing at a group of monsters that have already perished before he makes his move, he won't pick another target. But a number of significant improvements make Dragon Quest III's combat experience a lot more fun and rewarding than in the previous game. There are more enemies to fight than ever before, a whopping 127 different monsters that are variations on 50 unique sprites, more than both of the previous games combined. But as impressive as these numbers are, it's really the quality of the opposition that matters. And in Dragon Quest III, the specific combination of monsters you run into has a huge impact on what tactics will actually work. Some monsters have powerful abilities you'd rather they didn't get a chance to use, like the poison silkworm, which can poison your entire party with its toxic breath. Others cast powerful buffs that can change the course of combat. The Inferno Crab bolsters its allies' physical defense, and the Vampire Cat shuts your spellcasters down with Stop Spell. And if you encounter them both in the same battle, things can quickly get out of hand. Enemy AI routines are more varied and sophisticated. The Elysium Bird casts a single healing spell and then runs. The Archmage can bring its allies back to life in the middle of combat. And while enemies calling for reinforcements was already a thing in Dragon Quest II, some monsters now summon other types of enemies to the battlefield, like the Rogue Knight that recruits heal slimes to support them in combat. There is also the Bomb Crag, a seemingly harmless monster that keeps hanging back but eventually blows up in your face if you don't kill it fast enough. But the most significant factor that contributes to the complexity of the game's combat is the expanded spell selection. Dragon Quest III offers 60 different spells, almost 3 times as many as in the previous title. There's a wider variety of attack spells of different elements, some of which target individual monsters and others which hit entire groups, and the game gives you plenty of reason to use them all. Different enemies are strong against different types of spells, so you'll have to learn which ones work best against which foe. Some enemies resist magic entirely, while others are strong against physical attacks, so you'll want a healthy mix of both options. Buffs and debuffs also play a huge role this time around. Certain enemies can be a nightmare to deal with in their natural state, so regular use of spells like Increase and Defense is encouraged even in ordinary battles. Clever use of buffs and debuffs can turn even the most horrific encounter into a walk in the park, and towards the end of the game, I was using magic to swing the outcome of combat in almost every single encounter. There's also a bunch of really cool situational spells that can have a huge impact in the right situation. Bounce creates a wall that reflects spells back on the caster. Transform lets you copy the properties of another party member for the duration of the battle. And Ironize turns your whole party into metal, rendering them completely immune to damage but unable to act. Super situational, but weirdly effective in very specific situations. In fact, I don't think I've ever played an RPG that encouraged me to employ such a broad range of magic. I used every single option on my spell list at least once during my playthrough, and the majority of the spells saw regular use. Between the extensive monster roster, the significantly expanded spell list, and other improvements like the opportunity to set a party formation that lets you influence which characters take the brunt of the enemy's wrath, combat in Dragon Quest III is better than ever before. Battles are full of meaningful decisions. Every enemy has some sort of weakness, and the game rewards your mastery of the system in so many different ways. Trying to brute force your way through encounters gets tedious fast, and you can't just turn your brain off and spam a single button like in so many other Japanese RPGs. But the fact that you have to actually pay attention, even to ordinary enemies, makes the experience that much more stimulating, and figuring out how to defeat a specific monster can be very rewarding. The crazy thing is, though, that the best thing about Dragon Quest III's combat isn't even the combat system. It's that the game fixed the single biggest issue with the previous game, Dragon Quest II's fatal flaw. Even though Dragon Quest II ended up being a huge success, in the eyes of Nakamura and Horii, the game was a bit of a failure. As I've explained before, there simply hadn't been time at the end of a rushed development cycle to properly test the game, and the result was a wildly unfair and often frustrating product that left the two co-creators disillusioned and demoralized. For Dragon Quest III, they were determined not to repeat the same mistake, and the result is a much better balanced game. Monsters are challenging and interesting to deal with. Many enemy formations can seem outright unfair at first, but there's always a way to beat them if you consider the full range of your options. Even the game's climactic battles are so much more satisfying than in the previous game. Here, the final battle feels just right. A tense confrontation, but not a ridiculous one. Of course, it's not a perfect setup. Certain enemies can still wipe your entire party with a single spell. Some debuffs are too powerful when cast by enemies, and the outcome of battles depends a lot on who gets to go first. Heroes and enemies both hit hard, so hitting first means a lot. You can still die to a single critical hit, and making it through a long dungeon can be absolutely harrowing, especially if you haven't been doing a lot of grinding. Every time I reached a new region, I'd spend an hour or two farming monsters before I pushed forward. And in some play sessions, wandering back and forth looking for fights was all I did. Even so, Dragon Quest III felt less grindy to me than the previous games. It is a much larger adventure, so you'll end up fighting a lot of battles just by exploring the world and searching for secrets. And since combat is so much more interesting, I didn't mind fighting as much as before. But the main reason the grind feels so much more satisfying this time around is much simpler than that. This time, the progression system isn't busted. Dragon Quest II broke the fundamental promise of the RPG. A disastrous combination of factors meant that if you were having trouble with a certain part of the game, even gaining a couple of levels wouldn't help that much. You simply didn't get that much stronger as you powered up. With Dragon Quest III, it's a different story altogether. Changes to the fundamental math at the heart of the game means that gaining a couple of points of strength or equipping a new weapon actually has a noticeable impact now. And just a level or two can make a huge difference against any given monster. Part of the solution comes from the character's attributes. The previous games only had two major stats: power, which governed how hard you hit with weapons, and reaction, which determined how much damage you took from enemies. Dragon Quest III introduced three new attributes: intelligence, luck, and agility. While intelligence and luck have their own impact on the outcome of battles, it's really agility that makes the biggest difference. Agile characters act faster in combat, which means that as the heroes level up, they get quicker and quicker. And since battles in Dragon Quest III are often decided by a couple of attacks, a few more points of agility can save your life. Another factor is gear progression. There's twice as many weapons and armor as in the previous game, so the upgrades come more often. I still would have liked to see a couple more tiers of equipment to smooth out the progression through a very long adventure, but it's a huge improvement from the previous game. Dragon Quest III was also the first game in the series to introduce the concept of ability seeds and acorns, items that, when consumed, would permanently boost a character's attributes. The implementation isn't the best this time around. It doesn't play well with how stat baselines work, so the seeds do more harm than good a lot of the time, but it's still a fun addition to the overall progression system, and the idea has become a mainstay in the JRPG genre as a whole. Taken together, all of this means that in Dragon Quest III, getting stronger feels good, which is kind of the whole point of the traditional Japanese RPG. These games have a reputation for being grindy, and that's totally fair. But it should also be noted that grinding can be immensely satisfying. The fundamental gameplay loop of attempting something, finding it frustrating, taking a step back to gain some levels, buy some gear and try again, only to breeze through the part that gave you trouble before, might just be the most addictive thing about this genre. And in a time when most console games could be beaten in a couple of hours if you knew what you were doing, Dragon Quest III, a long and arduous quest that required days if not weeks of diligent effort to complete and offered tons of replayability to boot, would have been in very high demand, even if a lot of that time had to be spent grinding. Simply put, grinding in Dragon Quest III pays off. And that's a good thing, because you're gonna need it when you step into the game's increasingly complex dungeons. Dragon Quest III's dungeons are fundamentally similar to the ones from the previous game, but they're finally starting to feel less like randomly generated labyrinths and more like something you'd expect out of a JRPG. There's a level of sophistication to the experience that wasn't quite there before. There are more dungeons to explore, and the environments within them show a bit more variation, with the standard caves, castles and towers now sharing space with more imaginative adventure sites, like the trap-filled desert pyramid, a phantom ship crewed by the dead, and a solo dungeon that puts your mastery of the game to the test. There's a more deliberate feel to how rooms and passages are laid out, which make the dungeons more immersive and fun to explore. There are still some literal mazes here and there, but for the most part, finding your way is more about reading your environment and navigating by landmarks, like in the Dream Ruby Cave, where a dead end at one point lets you look across the water at your final destination, then use that knowledge to form a mental map of where you need to go. One thing that really impressed me right off the bat was the game's first dungeon, the Tower of Najima. The tower features 3 separate entrances, which anchors the location in the overworld in a way we haven't seen before, and allows you to make actual choices about how to approach it. The tower even has a 4th exit, a secret passage that leads back to Castle Aliahan, which you can use once you've claimed the Thief's Key. I love this kind of design, and I wish we'd see more of this in modern games. Another highlight is the game's use of the third dimension in designing its spaces. A lot of the game's dungeons are multi-floor environments, and a big part of pathfinding is figuring out how these layers stack on top of each other. Dungeons like Rubus's Tower and the Cave of Samanao require you to drop blindly between floors to reach key areas, and while some of these navigational puzzles rely a bit too much on trial and error, the overall concept is quite fun. Dragon Quest III's dungeons also feature some genuine puzzles. The pyramid has a riddle where you have to push the right buttons to proceed. A couple of dungeons feature special arrow tiles that change the direction of your movement, and there's a few obstacles that involve pushable boulders. The most fun of these is the puzzle in the basement of Egginbear Castle, where you have to figure out how to move 3 boulders into position to claim the treasure. It's all pretty primitive and a bit awkwardly designed, but I really appreciate the break from the standard dungeon crawl to do some critical thinking. Plot scenarios remain rare in dungeons, but there's more of it here than ever before. The encounter with Kandar and his henchmen in the Tower of Champagne was an early highlight for me, and getting to see the hero's father fight his last battle in the final dungeon was a nice touch. For the first time in the Dragon Quest series, some of the game's dungeons are not just satisfying to clear, but genuinely fun to explore. We're still a ways off from the kind of set-piece scenarios that JRPGs would eventually become known for, but Dragon Quest III's dungeons show a blueprint for how to get there. That said, dungeon crawling is still mostly a test of endurance. In my run through the Tower of Najima, I fought 31 battles in less than 30 minutes. That's not an estimate, by the way, I checked the footage. And that's for a relatively small dungeon. The amount of time you spend in combat versus the time you actually get to explore is absolutely dismal. And since the game still doesn't have any sort of mechanism to even out the distribution of random encounters, you'll sometimes only get to take a couple of steps before the next battle, and that can be absolutely demoralizing. Most dungeons still don't have a boss at the end, and this can feel anticlimactic. But when you consider just how much of a gauntlet this game's take on dungeon crawling can be, it really makes a lot of sense. A single bad encounter can spell your doom, there are still no save points to lock in your progress, and you can only carry a handful of medicinal herbs. Having to face a powerful boss monster at the end of a long harrowing journey is a horrifying proposition, and the few exceptions the game makes to this rule lead to some very tense encounters. But there is an upside to all of this. Dungeons in Dragon Quest III are scary, and that feeling of dangling between hope and despair as you go deeper and deeper, watching your resources dwindle with every step and praying it will somehow be enough, that's a powerful thing. There's a real sense of achievement in clearing the game's dungeons, and that's not something I often feel in modern games. And even though Dragon Quest III can still be brutal at times, the challenges you face feel genuinely fair. There are items that protect against instant death spells, although in a limited capacity. You can now have multiple party members with the revive spell, so you're less likely to be totally screwed. And you can even use magic to steal a bit of MP from the monsters along the way, giving you some extra staying power. Dragon Quest III feels tough but fair, and it does a better job than ever before in teaching new players how to navigate its challenges, especially when you consider the hidden tutorial at the start of the game. Following series tradition, Dragon Quest III starts with the hero setting out on a quest from a castle. This time, the castle town of Aliahan, the hero's birthplace. And once you've recruited your allies and left town, you'll find yourself in a vast open world for you to explore. Or at least, that's what we've come to expect. Because the island you're given to explore at the start of Dragon Quest III feels a lot more limited than the environments from the earlier titles. The whole island fits on a couple of screens, and aside from Aliahan, there's just a village of Reeve, the Tower of Najima, and a small shrine with some useful info available for you to inspect. The final location, the mysterious Cave of Enticement, remains sealed to you for the time being. And as auspicious and exciting as this beginning can feel, it doesn't rival the sense of head-spinning freedom I got from the first two games. Even so, the starting island has a lot going for it. it's a place where new players can learn the core gameplay loop in a safe environment, and it serves as a template in miniature for how the rest of the game will go. There's a castle to serve as your base, a nearby town with a wider selection of goods and more NPCs to pump for information once you're ready to make the trip, and a starter dungeon to tackle once you've found your feet. And while this restricted area can feel a bit stifling as a seasoned player, the terrain funnels you naturally to where you need to go, so you don't have to worry about finding the path. And the way off the island is locked behind a missing quest item, so you can't go too far either. You're given just enough leeway to wander near the Cave of Enticement, where the enemies are stronger, and get to experience what it feels like to get in over your head. The starting island is the perfect place in which to experiment and learn the basics, which is a good thing, since Dragon Quest III's player base would need a little time to get used to the big new thing, the vocation system. If you find you don't like the choices you made at the start, it's not too late to fix your mistakes, and the Tower of Najima is there to serve as your first real test, giving you a chance to try out what you've learned. The dungeon's multiple entrances also gives you a first taste of branching paths, which will be important later. And a hidden entrance near Reeve teaches you a lesson about paying attention to the world around you and looking for secrets. There's even a straight-up tutorial for how to push around boulders in the village of Reeve, though it doesn't become relevant until much later in the game. By using the starting island as a hidden game tutorial, Dragon Quest III eases new players into the experience. And in a sense, it's an extension of the formula from the original Dragon Quest. The first game deliberately locked you inside the throne room until you demonstrated that you knew how to read instructions and navigate the menus. Only then were you allowed to leave the room. This time, Dragon Quest III makes sure you understand the entire core gameplay loop before it lets you loose in the wider world. And once you retrieve the Thieves' Key from the Tower of Najima and use it to obtain the magic ball, you're ready for your final exam, the Cave of Enticement. This dungeon is by far the most challenging part of the game up until this point, and it forces you to prove that you fully understand how the game is played, that you have a well-rounded party that can handle most situations, that you know how to power up when you're too weak, that you can navigate dungeons, upgrade equipment, and deal with monsters. Which is a good thing, because when you finally stumble through that travel door at the end of the cave, you've not only proven you know what you're doing, you've won the right to true freedom. The Cave of Enticement was the choke point, and now a wide open part of the world spreads out before you, full of crossroads and branching paths. This is how Dragon Quest III structures its exploration gameplay, as a series of narrowings and widenings, choke points and sprawling expanses of freedom. Each major region of the game offers a lot of opportunities for free-form exploration, but eventually it all narrows down to a specific choke point, a bottleneck that must be passed to continue the quest. And once you clear that gap, you'll find a new region of renewed freedom waiting for you at the other end, and the process begins anew. The Cave of Enticement is the first choke point, and the continent behind it has some lessons of its own to impart, because there are other new mechanics the game would also like to show off. One of the ways Dragon Quest III enriches its exploration gameplay is through its day-night cycle. With every step you take on the world map, time passes, turning morning to evening and eventually night. You get your first taste of the cycle on the starting island, but the scope of this limited region isn't large enough for it to have much of an impact on your adventure. The Romali region is a different matter. The distances you have to cover to reach new locations and the presence of powerful new monsters as you range farther and wider within your new domain means you're likely to put in your first few sessions of grinding for experience and gold at this point. And that's where the day-night cycle comes into play. This is where you'll learn that random encounters are more frequent at night and that certain enemies only show up when it's dark, meaning that staying outside once the sun sets is a risky business. But the day-night cycle doesn't just affect the overworld. It also allows the game to recontextualize each location depending on the time of day. Many shops and services are only open during the day, but showing up at night can give you access to stuff that wasn't there in the daytime. NPCs often have different routines depending on the time of day and might have useful information if you show up at the right time. The first real demonstration of this concept comes in the village of Kanabe. Visit the cemetery at night and the ghost of a great warrior gives you a subtle hint about how claw weapons can benefit fighters. The town's eatery is closed at night, but a hidden stairway around the back leads to a loft apartment where the owners of the tavern spend their time off. And coolest of all, the item shop's proprietor goes to sleep in the back at night, giving you a chance to slip inside using the thief's key to steal some of his stock. Dragon Quest III features several locations that make heavy use of the day-night cycle to add texture to the environment and tell compelling stories. The town of Asaram is a sleepy hamlet by day but comes alive at night. And the village of Tidanki seems like a thriving community after dark, but if you visit during the day, you'll find it's all an illusion. The village has been destroyed by the Archfiend, and the ghosts of the slain villagers haunt their former home at night, unaware of their tragic fate. Similarly to the Romali region and the day-night cycle, each new region of the world has its own lessons to teach. The next major choke point is the Cave of Norud, beyond which you'll find a vast new territory with 7 new locations to explore, including the Temple of Dama. Reaching the Temple of Dama at this precise point in the quest makes a lot of sense. Not only are you about to hit level 20, making you eligible to change your character's vocations, but this is also around the point in the adventure where you've actually had enough time to get used to your party composition, learn the ins and outs of each character, and identify possible flaws. The temple is placed at precisely the point in the quest where you're the most likely to want to make a change. Not so early that you don't know what you're doing, but not so late that you'd have to grind forever to bring the altered characters back up to speed. And that's excellent design. Dragon Quest III also makes great use of one of the fundamental strengths of the traditional overworld. The top-down world map fell out of fashion shortly after console RPGs made the switch from 2D to 3D, in favor of seamless open-world environments. And as modern games have rendered their worlds in ever more detail and realistic texture, the idea of the world map feels very dated today. But I honestly feel that the potential of the traditional world map never came close to being fully realized before the practice fell out of favor. And the Dragon Quest series did some really cool things with the world map back in its day. The ability to show a bird's eye view that spans rivers, oceans, and mountains might not do wonders for immersion, but it lets the game foreshadow locations you cannot yet reach, building excitement for future discoveries. And it's also a way to hint at major paradigm shifts in how you explore the world. From around the point you cross through the Cave of Norud, the game starts to do something really clever. While poking around Olivia's Cape, you might have caught a glimpse of a mysterious island shrine across the inland sea. And if you head east from Baharat, you'll find an enticing chain of islands stretching along the coast. It stands to reason that you'll need some means to travel by sea in order to reach these locations. And you start to think that traveling by foot can feel kind of limiting. Which is just great, because once you clear the next major choke point and return to Portoga with the Black Pepper, you'll be rewarded with your very own sailing ship. And it's at this point that Dragon Quest III's world truly blows wide open, even if it's not quite what it seems at first glance. Just like in Dragon Quest II, getting the ship is a major milestone that feels tremendously liberating. You can now cross any body of water except for the ones blocked by shoals, make landfall anywhere except for in the mountains, and reach almost every location on the overworld. A vast world awaits you, and by my count, a total of 18 new points of interest become available to you from the moment you first set sail. The structure of the adventure also becomes more open-ended, where before there was always the one item you needed to fetch to continue your quest. The magic ball, the magic key, the black pepper. Now the game enters a more freeform stage. To proceed, you must gather the 6 orbs, which you'll need to revive the legendary phoenix Ramia. But the order in which you collect the orbs is mostly up to you. With only limited guidance for how to proceed, you're let loose on a world that feels massive and mysterious. And when you play the game without a guide, it's a sandbox of exploration and wonder. In 1988, a world this large and packed with this much content must have felt 100 times larger. But even today, exploring Dragon Quest III's vast oceans is still a lot of fun. I didn't know what I'd find when I'd set sail in a given direction, and that mystery and sense of discovery is a big part of what makes a game like this so good. The feeling that anything at all could be beyond the horizon. Which is why I find one particular design choice related to the game's world map so disappointing. When you first step into the wider world of Dragon Quest III, the vast landscape that stretches out before you feels strange and wonderful, full of mysterious places and unknown challenges. And while that is true, once you zoom out a little bit and get a sense for the bigger picture, you quickly realize that something is off. Because Dragon Quest III's islands and continents look more than a little familiar. The world you've explored up until this point is, in fact, nearly identical to our own Earth. Romali sits on the game's version of the Italian peninsula. Portoga represents Portugal, Noaniels and the village of the elves are in Scandinavia, and Egginbear is in England. The pyramids are in the Sahara, Bharata is in India, and Lancel is in Australia. And Jipang is, of course, Japan. Pretty much every location in the game is loosely inspired by some corresponding part of our world. Only the starting island of Aliahan is made up out of whole cloth, occupying a stretch of the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. Of course, this wasn't meant to be a surprise. I didn't realize it until I started to see some familiar features on my homemade map, but that's only because I never used the game's manual. If you owned this game back in the day, both the Japanese and the North American version came with full-size maps of the world, giving this so-called secret away immediately. The choice to model Dragon Quest III after our own world is a bit of a mixed bag. It grants the player a sense of familiarity that can be helpful when trying to remember what goes where, and some players have in fact reported using an actual map of Earth to navigate the game, which is pretty hilarious. But I'm personally not a big fan of this approach. Uncovering an unknown world by charting my steps through the game has been one of my favorite aspects of the Dragon Quest series up until this point, and realizing that all I was doing was sketching a copy of Earth's continents on graph paper took a great deal of the mystery and joy out of the process for me personally. The irony is that the Earth-shaped map almost didn't make it into the game, and it was because of Yuji Horii's principles. At the time, Horii was adamant that every idea he put into his games had to be something that hadn't been done before. Unfortunately for him, midway through development of Dragon Quest III, a Famicom RPG called Mirai Shinwa Jarvis came out, and that game too featured adventures in an Earth-like world. When Horii found out, he called an emergency meeting to discuss scrapping the world map he'd drawn up. But they were already too far gone to back down from the idea. Changing their minds at this point would have meant redoing everything. To Horii's chagrin, the Earth-shaped map stayed, and the rest is history. Regardless of the shape of the map, the stage of the game where you're searching for the 6 orbs forms the backbone of Dragon Quest III. And even though it may feel as if you've already been through a pretty sizable adventure at this point, the truth is that you've barely scratched the surface, because this is a very big adventure. One of the main selling points of Dragon Quest II had been its drastically larger world. Torland was 6 times larger than Dragon Quest's Alefgard, and the introduction of the sailing ship allowed for free-form exploration of the game's multiple continents and the vast ocean that surrounded them. Dragon Quest III doesn't offer the same enormous leap in size or scope. The new world fits in the same frame of 256 by 256 tiles, for a total of 65,536 tiles to explore. But the way it's designed makes it feel a lot larger. There's a better use of positive and negative space, a better sense of flow to exploration and discovery, and where large tracts of Dragon Quest II's world could feel empty or too far off the beaten path to matter, the third game's world invites exploration to a much higher degree. There's also a lot more locations to discover in this new world. Dragon Quest II may have expanded the map by 6 times, but it only doubled the number of places to find from the original game, so the overall feeling was one of emptiness. In the most generous interpretation of what counts as a location, Dragon Quest II had about 40 points of interest spread across its vast map, which translates to around 1500 tiles to explore per thing to find. By the same way of counting, Dragon Quest III has a little over 60 points of interest, which is closer to 1000 tiles to cover before stumbling over something cool. More importantly, the locations are spaced better across the world, ensuring that every major section of the map has something interesting about it. The result is that even though the world is the same size as before, it feels a lot larger. This is a big game, and by Famicom standards, it's positively enormous. There were multiple times during the adventure where I felt I had to be in the home stretch and almost done, only to realize that there was a ton of stuff left to do. And by the time you're dealing with the final dungeon, even the Cave of the Necrogond, which I thought had to be close to the end, feels like a lifetime ago. With a world this large and so many places to see, it's natural to feel a bit overwhelmed. And I definitely felt lost at times. But the thing is, if you're playing the game the right way, you're going to have all the information you need to make steady progress. If you're used to playing modern games, which at the bare minimum offer clear written instructions for your next task, often accompanied by map markers for where to go to proceed with the quest, if not outright GPS waypoints, a game like Dragon Quest III can feel bewildering. There's no quest log, very few cutscenes to remind you of what you're doing, and only a bare minimum of direct instructions. And if you've been trained to treat NPC dialogue as nothing but flavor text, the quest for the 6 orbs can be downright confusing. Because Dragon Quest III actually provides an abundance of guidance for how to complete your quest, but you have to pay close attention to what people are telling you. The original Dragon Quest set out a basic formula for how these games should be structured. It gave you a clear goal, reach Charlock Castle and defeat the Dragon Lord, and then set you loose in the wider world without further ado. But all the information you needed to beat the game could be found by talking to the game's many NPCs and carefully considering their words. This formula worked exceptionally well, guiding you towards your ultimate destination without restricting your movements. Dragon Quest III follows the same formula, and honestly, given how large the adventure is and the amount of freedom you have, the game's ability to keep you on the straight and narrow is actually fairly remarkable. All the information you need to figure out the steps you have to take to complete the adventure is given to you through NPC dialogue. So long as you travel far and wide, talk to everyone you see, and make notes on what they say, proceeding through the quest is pretty straightforward. Where to find the final key, what to do with the Sword of Gaia, and why you might want the 6 orbs, these are all things that NPCs tell you outright if you'll just listen. It's not a single guy with an exclamation mark above his head giving a clear objective with lots of description, but bits and pieces of hints and rumors scattered across multiple people throughout the world. And the fun part is that you get to put it all together and figure out what it means. A puzzle, not a set of instructions. And that's really cool. While this balance between freedom and guidance really impressed me, I cannot say the same for another aspect of exploration. Dragon Quest III is a fairly open-ended experience, but that obviously doesn't mean you can go anywhere right from the start. And there's still a lot to be desired about how the game structures your access to its content. For the most part, exploration in Dragon Quest III works much the same as in the previous games. You travel across an overworld full of different types of terrain. Rivers, oceans and mountains cannot be passed without the proper mode of transportation, and in addition to certain choke points, which require specific plot coupons to pass, there are also locked doors that cannot be opened until you found the right key. A small quality of life upgrade concerns the way the game handles these keys. Dragon Quest II had 4 such items that all opened a different set of doors. In Dragon Quest III, the 3 keys are basically upgrades over each other, meaning that once you find a more advanced key, you can safely put the previous one in storage. Saving your game is now restricted to a few specific locations, including the game's castles and the Temple of Dama. But you actually have more freedom in where you start and stop your sessions this time around, because of a major upgrade to the game's most important spell. Instead of sending you back to the last place you saved your game, Return now lets you pick your destination from a list of locations you've previously found. This includes all the castles and most of the game's towns, so you're eventually able to bridge any distance with ease just by using this spell. This ability is obviously very convenient, and reaching a new town feels super significant, but I can't help but feel that being able to zip around the world at will takes something away from the feeling of being on an epic adventure. I've never really been a big fan of fast travel, and I think it's a pretty lazy solution to dealing with backtracking. Instead of dropping a massive buff on the return spell, I would have liked to see the game put a stronger emphasis on its network of travel doors, the teleportation tiles that lie scattered across the world's different shrines and allow for instant travel between fixed locations. This would have made finding a new key even more of a treat, and working out different routes to aid your travels could have been a lot of fun. As it is, I found the travel door network pretty much pointless, and outside of the one time you have to use it, I never really bother with it at all. And as I've said for all 3 games so far, they could have done a lot more with the quest items, to make them feel more like permanent upgrades instead of one-time keycards. The 6 orbs could have each conferred some sort of boon to your characters, like maybe bonus attributes or a boost to certain spells. The perfect fit for a set of items you can fetch in any order. And items like the Sailor's Thigh Bone, Mirror of Ra, and Vase of Drought could have worked more like Metroidvania upgrades that change the way you interact with the world. Like maybe the Vase of Drought allowed you to raise a series of sunken shrines from the ocean instead of just the one, which could have expanded the travel door network even further. The closest Dragon Quest III comes to this design philosophy is with the Staff of Change, which can be used to disguise the party as non-humans, allowing you to trick the elves of the hidden village into selling you some really cool gear. Unfortunately, this is just a one-time thing, and you have to hand the staff over to an NPC to proceed with your quest, which is really quite a shame. Aside from the 3 keys, there are really only 2 major upgrades that have a lasting effect on how you interact with the world. The first is the sailing ship, and we've already talked about how much of a game changer getting it is. The second major upgrade comes much later, and by comparison, it's extremely underwhelming. After you've finally gathered the 6 orbs, you can take them to a temple in the frozen wastes of Liamland and place them at the sacred altar to awaken the phoenix, Ramia. With Ramia's aid, you can now fly across oceans and mountains far beyond the reach of monsters, land anywhere, and reach the final 3 locations on the overworld that were previously inaccessible to you, including Baramos' castle, where the Archfiend awaits you. This sounds cool in theory, but in reality, the Phoenix is kind of a letdown. Sure, it's a nice feeling to be able to go anywhere in the world without having to worry about random encounters, but there's only a few locations left to visit, and you barely have a chance to make use of this newfound freedom before it's taken away from you anyway. And honestly, when compared to the airship from Final Fantasy, which came out a couple of months before this game, the Phoenix feels pretty lame. It's slow, the controls are clunky, and it's poorly integrated into the world. It's a glorified keycard with wings, and the one good thing I can say about it is that the music that plays when you're flying is really nice. For all of the freedom you have in tackling some of the steps along the way, Dragon Quest III is still a fairly linear experience. But there's also a lot of optional content here, and it can be argued that the game began a trend towards what I would call the modern JRPG template. Over the years, there is one aspect of gameplay that Japanese RPGs have become particularly famous for: the large volume of optional content. This is, of course, a matter of definition. After all, Western RPGs tend to feature less linear narratives and more open-ended design, and games like Fallout or Baldur's Gate include an enormous amount of locations, characters, and storylines that are not required to beat the game. In fact, the vast majority of content in a game like Skyrim is entirely optional. But even though Western RPGs usually do present a main story, the focus is usually more so on the player's own chosen path, and it's not unusual for people to put dozens or even hundreds of hours into these games without even bothering with the central plot. By contrast, Japanese RPGs have tended to draw a sharper line between the main story and the side content. As time went by, what began as mostly player-driven adventures in the style of Dragon Quest or the original Final Fantasy shifted towards a more focused, character-driven narrative, where the telling of a predefined story with fixed characters forms the heart of the experience, more so than writing your own adventure. So when I finally sat down to play the original Dragon Quest for the first time last year, I was struck with how open-ended the experience was. Having grown up with the Japanese RPGs of the 90s and early 2000s, being dropped into a nearly wide open world with almost no story to guide you and no clear instructions on how to proceed felt seriously disorienting. Dragon Quest is a game that could be played in many different ways, and aside from a handful of milestones you have to hit to reach the end, you could really choose your own path through the quest. That said, as much control as you have over the adventure, there's really not a lot of optional content in that game. Sure, some weapons and armor can be skipped, one of the dungeons is optional, and you don't have to rescue the princess. But nearly all of the game's content will be seen by the player in the average playthrough. The same cannot be said for Dragon Quest III. There's a lot more stuff you can do in this game that isn't connected to the main story, and some of it is really cool. The quest to retrieve the Dream Ruby to break the curse on the sleeping village of Noaniels can be skipped, as can the confrontation with the bandit Lord Kandar in the Tower of Champagne. Key items like the echoing flute, the silver harp, and the lamp of darkness can be useful to have, but you don't need to get them. Cool optional treasure like the meteorite armband is a bonus reward for diligent explorers, and even the game's ultimate set of equipment, including the Sword of Kings, can be safely ignored. There are more optional locations on the world map than ever before, including 6 of the game's 18 dungeons. There's also the village of Muor, where the townspeople mistake the hero for his father Ortiga, and diligent exploration rewards you with an item called the Water Blaster, a completely pointless toy that lets you go around spraying people with cold water. But the game's coolest bit of optional content is even more elaborate. Building on the idea of the lottery from Dragon Quest II, the third game features the series' first incarnation of the Monster Arena. 4 of the world's towns feature underground fighting pits where monsters duke it out on the sands of the arena floor, allowing you to bet on the outcome by putting your money on your favorite beastie. It's entirely voluntary, and there are quicker ways to earn gold in this game, but watching monsters beat up on each other from the safety of the sidelines is a nice change of pace from risking your own life, and betting on fights can get pretty addictive. Even some of the so-called mandatory steps on the critical path can be made optional if you know what you're doing. All of the game's keys could theoretically be skipped if you have the patience to level a wizard high enough to learn the Open spell. And if you're able to cast the Invisibility spell, it will do just fine in place of the Invisibility herb. There's even an optional super boss for you to take on if you so choose, kind of. Normally, to beat the final boss, you're supposed to first use the Sphere of Light to strip him of his power. But as hard as the boss is to beat without taking this step, it's not actually impossible. So if you want to challenge yourself with a much tougher showdown, the choice is there for you to make. Where Dragon Quest set down the basic formula for what a traditional JRPG was expected to be, I would argue that it was Dragon Quest III that provided the template for what the modern JRPG would eventually become. A mostly linear main story progression with a tight critical path centered on a series of set-piece scenarios, but with lots of optional content along the way. And of course, a crucial part of that template is the one that grew more and more elaborate with each game. Dragon Quest III, the final chapter of the so-called Erdrick trilogy, takes place many years before the original Dragon Quest and is set in a different world from the previous games. You are the son or daughter of Ortega, a legendary warrior from the isolated island kingdom of Aliahan, who disappeared years ago after apparently falling into a volcano during his battle with the Dragon Queen. On your 16th birthday, you're taken before the king and granted the right to follow in your father's footsteps. Your task: to defeat the archfiend Baramos, whose presence clings to the land like a foul paw, and who must be defeated lest he destroy the world. After recruiting a party of like-minded allies, you set out from Aliahan to travel the world and complete your father's quest, having many adventures along the way. To achieve your goal, you must acquire a sailing ship, retrieve the 6 mystical orbs, and revive the legendary phoenix Ramia, on whose wings you can reach Baramos' castle high in the mountains of the Necrogond and confront the wicked archfiend. But Baramos is only the beginning, and your quest will take you beyond the edge of the known realm. In the process, you'll discover the fate of your father, become a legend that will shine for generations to come, and leave behind a legacy of heroism. Even though the fundamental framework of Dragon Quest III's story follows the same conventions as in the previous 2 games, a traditional good versus evil quest, simplistic setups, extremely light cutscenes, and limited dialogue, the breadth and quality of the scenarios presented is a huge step up. There's a lot of little stories within the story in Dragon Quest III. Some of the most memorable ones are rescuing Tanya and Galen from the kidnapper's cave, breaking the curse that holds the people of Nuanials in magical sleep, sneaking into Castle Egginbear to claim the Vase of Drought, and tracking and boarding the Phantom ship to extract the Lover's Locket from its crew of damned souls. In my view, the most elaborate and entertaining scenario is probably the one that deals with the Wicked King of Samanau. Here, you first gather information in town before heading off to the nearby cave to retrieve the Mirror of Ra, then sneak into the castle through the kitchens at night to infiltrate the king's bedchamber and confront the monster that's taken possession of the king. The day-night cycle and the game's richer environments really come into their own here. We also start to see a bit more complex interactions with NPCs, like presenting the royal scroll to the dwarf Norud and following him through the underground passage. The scene that plays out between Galen and Tanya's grandfather in Baharata, or the 2 confrontations with the bandit Lord Kandar at the Tower of Champagne and the Kidnapper's Cave. These scripted interactions begin to approach what we would refer to as cutscenes in later games, and a little bit of drama is a fun way to break up the core gameplay. And as a side note, you could maybe argue that Kandar is one of, if not the first, of a familiar archetype of goofy, recurring subvillains that would later become a mainstay of this genre. The confrontation with Zoma is also a big step up from before. The final approach to the villain's throne room has a great weight to it. Lurid flames flicker alive on the dark path ahead before the chamber floods with light and the villain strides forth to welcome you to your doom. It feels like a prototype for the battle with Magus in Chrono Trigger, another Yuji Horii story, and Zoma throwing his lieutenants at you one by one in an attempt to break your will is a great elaboration on the bare-bones setup from Dragon Quest II, where Hargon's lieutenants were simply checkpoints along the way to the villain's lair. I also love how the Sphere of Light serves as a great narrative device for showing just how powerful Zoma can be without the aid of the divine. And the post-battle scene of the crumbling castle is a great finish to a climactic encounter. Dragon Quest III's story also has a bunch of cool surprises and twists. Throwing the Sword of Gaia into the volcano to make a path of sand across the water is a cute reversal of the beat from Dragon Quest II, where you flooded a dry riverbed to open the way to the Tower of the Moon. And passing through the Cave of the Necrogon evokes the Cave to Roan, but when you're expecting to find an entire new region on the other side, like in the second game, stumbling out to see nothing but a lonely shrine and a forbidding view of the villain's castle across the water is a nice touch. But the biggest twist of all is the one that comes after you defeat Baramos, because the game isn't actually over yet, and you're about to find yourself in some very familiar territory. By the third game in the series, fans of Dragon Quest would have fallen into a familiar pattern of play. You explore a vast world, level up your heroes, and map out every possible town, dungeon, and shrine, before delving into the villain's castle to confront the ultimate evil. And Dragon Quest III follows this formula to a T until it doesn't. Defeating the Archfiend Baramos in the depths of its castle makes for a satisfying conclusion to an epic quest. It's a breathtaking battle against a devastating foe that feels on par with the Dragon Lord or the Wizard Hargon. The game then sends you on your customary victory lap, a sequence where you're free to wander the world unmolested by monsters, visiting the various locations you've covered along your quest to bask in the adulation of the people you've saved. You return to Aliahan a true hero. You've fulfilled your promise, completed your father's quest, and lived up to your legacy. You've won. Or rather, that's what the game wants you to think. Because right as the trumpets sound in celebration of your glory, a thunderous quake interrupts the festivities. The music silences, as one by one the people around you are struck down by an unseen force, and a mysterious voice that drips with venom proclaims that your journey is not yet done. Zoma, the master archfiend, waits for you in the world of darkness. Diligent exploration eventually leads you to the Pit of Giaga, where the earthquake has raised the wall around the gaping chasm. With a leap of fate, you hurl yourself into the pit to find yourself in a mysterious new land shrouded in permanent night. And as you catch your bearings, you learn the shocking truth. The world of darkness is the land of Alefgard. The same Alefgard which was once saved by the legendary Erdrick and in which his descendant, your hero from the original Dragon Quest, made a name for himself. And finally, it all makes sense. Dragon Quest III isn't a sequel to the previous two games, it's a prequel, and you are the legendary Erdrick. Making Alefgard the mysterious world of darkness at the heart of the world was a groundbreaking twist that fueled the imaginations of a generation of gamers and set a standard for massive world-altering plot twists in the JRPG genre, the influence of which can be clearly traced to games like Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Star Ocean 2. And this twist was perfectly set up by the game's structure. By the time you reach Baramos' castle, you're likely to have seen enough of the world to realize there's nothing left to do. It really seems like you're right at the end, but the game did drop a couple of clues to suggest that you could be wrong. There's the Sphere of Light, which you get from the dying Dragon Queen, without any clear indication of what use it could possibly be against Baramos. And of course there's the Pit of Giaga, a seemingly pointless location that hints at a greater purpose. Just enough foreshadowing to let savvy players know that something was a little bit off, without making the twist too obvious. As a fan of the previous two games, the prospect of returning to a version of Alefgard from the distant past was genuinely exciting to me. I love seeing all these familiar places and finding out what stayed the same and what used to be different. It's cool to see the town of Hawksness before the fall, Garin's family house that eventually became his tomb, and to finally meet Rubis, the hero's benefactor from Dragon Quest II, and find out just what debt to Erdrick's family she was repaying in that game. There's also a ton of clever references that tie the trilogy together in a satisfying way, retroactively making the world of Dragon Quest feel even more alive. In Cantlin, we get to meet the future creator of the Golem. The Marsh Cave is a construction site, where workers are still digging the unfinished tunnel to Rimuldar. We get the origins of Erdrick's token, his famous sword, and the Sphere of Light, and after beating the game, you yourself can deposit the Stones of Sunlight with the old man in the basement beneath Tantagle Castle. And at the end of the game, the King of Tantagle dubs you Erdrick, as a token of his great esteem. Not a name, after all, but a title. and maybe I'm reading too much into this one, but I feel like the egg of the dying Dragon Queen is the yet-to-be-hatched Dragon Lord from the first game, or at least an ancestor of his. Having to grow up without the wisdom of his mother might have been what led him to use his powers not to protect the world, but to terrorize it. And honestly, it doesn't really matter whether this connection was intentional or not. What's cool is that I'm even having the thought in the first place. Of course, Dragon Quest III's story feels primitive by today's standards. A lot of the plot points have a random quality to them, and much of the adventure is just a series of fetch quests. There's no real tension, and the Archfiend Baramos isn't integrated into the story in a meaningful way. The Alefgard twist is cool, but there's no build-up to the big reveal, and the one red thread the story has, the mystery of what happened to the hero's father, is spread so thinly across the adventure. By the time I finally found Ortega, I'd honestly forgotten he even existed. But none of that was a big deal back in 1988, because the real story of Dragon Quest III is all in your head. As an adult gamer experiencing Dragon Quest III for the first time, I keenly felt the absence of a proper story with actual characters, elaborate cutscenes, and clever dialogue. The narrative aspect tends to be the one that entices and motivates me the most when I'm playing a game. Not having any protagonists to get to know and to root for is a serious problem for me these days, even if the game is otherwise fun. But I wasn't always that way. I was, after all, once a child. This is, at its heart, a role-playing game, and the game really does invite you to play a role. Yuji Horii famously made the hero of Dragon Quest deliberately mute, to avoid putting words in the player's mouth. Dragon Quest III is a bigger sandbox than ever before, with more to see and more to do, and how you choose to engage with this world is up to you. Towns and castles are more elaborate than before, and many features serve no purpose other than to add flavor. The extensive dungeons beneath Castle Samanao, the nightclub in Asaram, the rooftop garden in Castle Isis, and the observatory in Luzami are all examples of things that don't strictly need to be there, but add a ton of texture to the game's world. And just look at how massive the king's throne room is in Castle Aliahan. It didn't have to be nearly that big to fill its function. It's all done in the name of immersion. Dragon Quest III's world feels so much more real. Most shops are closed at night, and you're not allowed into the castle after dark, so you'll have to rest until morning before saving your game. NPCs have different routines depending on the time of day, and they sometimes react to events in the story. And if you need a break, you can head back home, have a chat with your grandfather, and sleep in your own bed. There are also more ways to interact with the world. You can render yourself invisible using magic and go around scaring people, troll them with blasts from a toy water pistol, or use the Staff of Change to turn your party into slimes. You even get to help found a new town on a remote continent, then watch it grow as the story progresses. It's a testament to Dragon Quest III's design philosophy that it actually lets you choose your gender at the start of the game, but then never incorporates this choice into the story. Not even the hero's mom acknowledges the fact that you chose to be a girl. Yuji Horii later admitted he basically forgot that the hero could be male or female until it was too late to do anything about it. But I would argue it doesn't really matter. The choice itself is the point. It matters, not because it changes anything, but because so much of the story takes place inside your head. So picking your gender, even though it doesn't impact the story at all, still feels like a meaningful decision. Dragon Quest III has an entire optional side quest where the King of Romali convinces you to take over his job. You can walk around the castle in the king's raiments and crown, interacting with people who all respond to you as if you were the new king. It's completely irrelevant whether you engage with this content or not, and there's no material reward to claim. The only benefit you get is the fuzzy feeling of knowing you've done a decent thing for the people of Romali, and getting to act like a king for a day. The literal meaning of the RP in RPG. Dragon Quest III's story is what you make of it. Today, I struggle with motivation when games lack a fully realized plot and solid characters. and walking around Romali pretending to be the king seems like a huge waste of time. But that's because I've lost my childlike imagination. As a kid, I'd play with Legos, building a castle and a town, and pretend I was a knight or a king who governed the domain as my own. There was no point to it. I was just telling stories to myself and my friends. I didn't need for someone to tell me who the characters were or how the story went. I'd make that all up on my own, without even knowing I was doing it. And if I'd played Dragon Quest III as a kid, I probably would have wandered the halls of Romali in the king's outfit over and over and over just for fun. And that's just the thing. The vast majority of the people who played this game when it was new were children. Children who had never seen a more advanced game than Dragon Quest III, who might have never played an RPG before at all. Now they got to create an entire roster of heroes from their own imaginations, explore 2 massive worlds, fight 100 different monsters, explore fiendish dungeons, claim marvelous treasure, resurrect a legendary phoenix, defeat an evil overlord, and rescue a goddess from an ancient curse. And they were the hero of this epic story. It's no wonder this game did really, really well. Dragon Quest III was a smash hit, the kind of landmark title that only comes around every once in a while. There aren't a lot of reliable sources for this data, since sales numbers for video games is unreliable at the best of times, and few reputable actors had started tracking this sort of thing at the time. But the story goes that upon release in February of 1988, Dragon Quest III sold 1 million copies on the first day. In all likelihood, the first video game in history to achieve this feat in such a short time. The game then went on to sell 3 million copies by the end of the first week, making it easily one of the fastest selling games of all time back in those days. And all this in an era long before digital sales became a factor in the industry, a time when gamers got their gaming news from a handful of monthly or, in the best case, weekly magazines. What we do know for sure is that no matter how you slice it, Dragon Quest III was a tremendous success, and its impact on Japanese culture, not just Japanese gaming culture, but actual mainstream culture, can hardly be exaggerated. It was the best-selling game in Japan between 1986 and 1989, and Famitsu likened its march into Japanese homes as similar to the military campaigns of Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great. Dragon Quest III became a cultural phenomenon. The game and its many players got extensive media coverage in the national news, to the point where pretty much everyone knew it existed, even if they didn't understand what it was. Thousands of people queued overnight outside of electronics stores for a shot at buying the game, and those who showed up without a pre-order ticket found that a day one purchase was all but impossible. Countless kids skipped school on a weekday to avoid missing out, and the story even goes that some unlucky customers coming back from the store with their game in hand were robbed on the way home by malcontents who hadn't gotten in line to buy the game early enough. It all got so bad that in the aftermath, the police contacted Enix to request that the company take responsibility for the chaos they had unleashed, and find a way to prevent this from happening again in the future. This resulted in Enix entering into a gentleman's agreement to only release future Dragon Quest games on weekends and public holidays. As I mentioned in my retrospective about the original game, a persistent urban legend garbled this agreement, making it out to mean that this arrangement had been written into Japanese law. But this was obviously never the case. Of course, Dragon Quest III wouldn't have made the mark it did on the gaming world if it hadn't been for the previous 2 games. This isn't the story of a runaway hit. It's the story of a wave of momentum that had been building since 1986, and which now came crashing down in spectacular fashion. The success of Dragon Quest and Dragon Quest II sowed the seeds for the kind of mass hysteria that broke out over the 3rd game. Without that foundation in place, 1 million people wouldn't have lined up on day one to get their hands on this game. It would probably still have been a big hit, but it wouldn't have had the legacy it has today. the third game's matured take on the Dragon Quest formula proved to be the perfect tonic for a generation of gamers who had gotten hooked on console RPGs in general and Dragon Quest in particular, just in time for the pièce de résistance. For an audience hyped up on Dragon Quest fever, a new hit of their favorite drug was a gift from the gods. And along came Dragon Quest III, the ultimate Dragon Quest. Bigger, better, and with more replayability than the previous games. A napalm strike in a tinderbox. But as Dragon Quest fever gripped Japan, the rest of the world looked on in mild fascination, writing articles about the Japanese gaming phenomenon without really understanding the appeal of the game or what was actually going on. The original Dragon Quest wouldn't even make it out of Japan until 1989, and it would take another 3 years before Dragon Quest III made it to North America. When it did, the juggernaut that had taken Japan by storm fizzled out without even striking a spark in the English-speaking world. Because in 1992, no one really cared about Dragon Quest III. Due to a trademark conflict, the early Dragon Quest games ended up being released in North America as Dragon Warrior, which is why Dragon Quest III used to be known as Dragon Warrior 3 in the Western world. While the North American versions of the first two games received major improvements that arguably made them the definitive editions, such as the introduction of a battery-powered save feature, the changes to Dragon Warrior 3 were less significant. A proper title screen with music was added, where the Japanese version threw you right into a simple white-on-black menu without a soundtrack. There's also a prologue sequence that shows Ortega's battle with the Dragon Queen on top of the volcano, which is kinda cool. The hero's father also got his own death theme that plays when he kicks the bucket, and the sprite used to represent him in this fateful battle was replaced with a unique one, though I honestly might have preferred the generic one. I kinda liked the idea that the hero's dad was an absolute unit of an axe-wielding Giga Chad in wrestling briefs and a hood. I totally get what the hero's mom saw in this guy. There are a couple of changes to smoothen out the gameplay. Newly created characters now start with some basic equipment, where in the Japanese version they only got basic clothes. And a general 25% boost to experience and gold gained from monsters makes the game a bit less grindy. In the end, none of these improvements made much of a difference. By the time the game finally made it to North America, it was already March of 1992, and I gotta be honest, I'm surprised they even bothered. In the fast-moving world of early 90s gaming, Dragon Warrior 3 was old news, and the same was true for the console. You'd have a hard time convincing us kids to spend our allowance on an NES game when we could be playing Final Fantasy IV, released 4 months earlier for the Super Nintendo as Final Fantasy II. Or saving up for The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past or Street Fighter II, which both came out a couple of months later. Dragon Warrior 3 reportedly sold about 95,000 copies in North America, and that's honestly more than I would have expected. At this point, the fate of the Dragon Quest franchise in the West was pretty much sealed, at least for the time being. And it all comes back to that fateful decision made years earlier. In 1989, Enix and Nintendo of America gambled that the original Dragon Quest would be just as big a hit in North America as it had been 3 years earlier in Japan. They were wrong. Had they chosen to skip the earlier titles and instead localized the latest entry in the series, they might have been able to bring Dragon Warrior 3 to market in 1989, when the NES was still in its prime and the game was still state-of-the-art. If they had, history might have looked very different for the Dragon Quest franchise in the West. But I guess we'll never know. Dragon Quest III has also seen a couple of remakes over the years. Following the success of 1993's Dragon Quest I and II bundle for the Super Famicom, an upgraded version of the third game was released in 1996. The enhanced graphics are fairly mediocre for a late 16-bit title, but it's a big step up from the Famicom original, and the addition of battle backgrounds and spell animations make combat a bit more lively. The UI got upgraded and streamlined, and you can finally use a button on the gamepad to interact contextually with the environment for talking, searching, and opening doors. Character creation got a bit more interesting, and the vocation system got an overhaul with the introduction of the thief vocation, new spells for the merchant and goof-off, and the addition of personalities that affect a character's stat growths. There's a ton more weapons and armor to find, a bonus dungeon with new monsters and a super boss, and a bunch of other useful and fun features. Another version of the game was released for the Game Boy Color in 2000, redesigning the adventure for the pocket format and adding yet another bonus dungeon, along with a few other features and differences. There's also been a mobile version and re-releases for the 3DS, PlayStation 4 and the Nintendo Switch. And of course, there's the brand new HD 2D remake, which stands poised to be the new definitive version of this classic game. The Dragon Quest series has come a long way since 1988, and later games in the series have arguably eclipsed the third game in every conceivable way. But Dragon Quest III has a special place in the franchise's history, not just because it cemented the series' position as the undisputed champion of the console RPG, but also because it was the culmination of two men's vision. Before I go on, I just want to say if you enjoyed this video, I'd be super grateful if you could hit the like button and leave a quick comment, as it really helps the video reach more people. I read every comment I get, no matter how old the video is. And if you want to support me, consider subscribing to my channel, so I know people want to see more videos like this. Dragon Quest III was a playground of the imagination. Possibly the most ambitious 8-bit console RPG ever made, the game packed so much content, so much discovery, and so much replayability into a single package. It offered more value for your money than perhaps any other cartridge sold for the NES. But like most games from the 8-bit era, Dragon Quest III feels old today. Combat, while strategic, lacks something in the way of excitement. The menu system feels clunky and archaic, and trudging through 1,000 random encounters has long since lost its appeal. But there's still a lot to love about this game. Finding your way through a massive overworld filled with interesting locations is addictive. Creating and nurturing your own party of adventurers is satisfying. And learning the ins and outs of a challenging but rewarding combat system is still fun. Dragon Quest III can be pretty grinding at times, and without an engaging story or memorable characters to keep me focused, I did struggle at times with motivation, especially early on. The game still lacks some of the things I personally look for from the golden age of Japanese role-playing games, but as an expression of what we mean when we say traditional JRPG, it's an extremely solid experience. And the fundamental concept remains just as strong as in 1988. Dragon Quest III is also where the series cemented its core identity. This is where Dragon Quest really started to come into its own with its unique blend of Western fantasy and Akira Toriyama's trademark style, mixed with quirky Japanese humor and just a dash of pervy goodness. And even though there aren't any real characters to speak of in this game, designs like the Pilgrim and Soldier from the Vocation system have become so iconic to the series they might as well be recurring characters. Even though I've been a huge fan of Japanese role-playing games since the mid-90s, before I set out to create these retrospectives, my relationship with the series that started it all was non-existent. I never crossed paths with the series as a kid, and as an adult, I didn't see the appeal. But after playing through the original Erdrick trilogy, I think I finally do. There's a familiarity that builds the more you see of these games. Recognizable monsters, recurring gameplay elements, and tried and true ideas. Where competitors like the Final Fantasy series has strived to reinvent itself with each new entry. Often to the chagrin of at least a subset of the existing fanbase, Dragon Quest has remained mostly true to its roots. No massive changes or drastic course corrections, just a series of iterations on the same winning formula. The more you play, the more the series starts to feel like an old friend. The kind that, even when it's been years since you last spoke, when you meet up again, it's instantly effortless. So if you liked the games in the past, you're probably going to like the next one. And behind that stability lies a single, unifying vision. Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura wanted to make a console version of the sophisticated Western computer RPGs that had captured their imaginations. But they couldn't do it all at once. Instead, they had to take it step by step. Dragon Quest introduced the formula and got a new generation of gamers hooked. Dragon Quest II added complexity and strategy and a much larger adventure. Dragon Quest III brought it all together by introducing player choice. Horii and Nakamura themselves felt that with Dragon Quest III, the game structure had been perfected. Dragon Quest was now complete. A fully realized console RPG that could stand up to scrutiny by any standard. A game bursting at the seams with content, charm, and fun factor. This is the game Nakamura and Horii dreamed of when they first set out to make RPGs for the Nintendo Famicom. Their own masterpiece RPG that would rival Ultima and Wizardry, while introducing a whole new generation of gamers to the greatest genre of gaming there ever was. They had done everything they had set out to do, and there was nowhere else to go when it came to refining the basic formula. Which is why the next game in this series would have to find a different direction to grow. But that's a story for another time. Anyway, I'm just some guy on YouTube and these are just my personal opinions. Whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear about your experiences with Dragon Quest III in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.